So our next speaker is Moritz Feigl, who is with the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria. His talk title is Learning from Mistakes, Assessing the Performance and Uncertainty in Process-Based Models.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my slides?
Yep, there they are.
Okay. Hi, and good evening from Vienna. My name is Moritz, and I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Hydrology and Water Management at the BOKU in Vienna. And the work I'm presenting today is what I started while I still was a visiting researcher at the University of Calgary in the group of Masaki Hayashi. And the topic is learning from mistakes, assessing the performance and uncertainty in process-based models. Process-based models are mathematical representations of physical processes and are based on detailed measurements and often also some kind of parameter estimation. However, even after setting up such a model and having it based on extensive knowledge and a lot of data, model errors still exist. And with model errors, I mean the difference between observations and simulations, often called model residuals. And if those model errors are not random, there are three general reasons for them to occur. First, they can be due to simplified or misrepresented processes. Second, they can be due to missing processes, but it can also be due to measurement errors. And all of these errors have the potential to either lead to biased conclusion when you use the model, or they can also be negligible for the application of the model. And the point is, we don't know. And this brings us to our research question, is to develop an objective method to analyze model errors of process-based models to gain further insight and enhance trust in the applied model. And for that, we developed a workflow we called learning from mistakes. And as you see here in this flow chart, it consists of 7 steps. And the upper row can be summarized as the process-based model application. And the lower row is the error analysis. And it starts with using variables, observed variables, as input for our process-based model, which we use to simulate our system. And with that, we can compute model errors, so a time series of model errors. And here comes the main idea of this workflow. If we are able to predict these model errors from available data, then we can assess the relationship between input variables and model errors to gain further insight into the error process relationships. And for that, we use a machine learning model to predict model errors based on available variables. And this includes the inputs to the process-based model, but as well as any other kind of variable we have available. And I want to go a bit more into detail for these 2 next steps. So when you apply machine learning for predicting model errors, this is of course, so the choice of machine learning model is depending on the type of error structure we have and the type of models, or if it's like maps or time series. But usually any type of time series prediction model, or if you need some maps of errors, CNN work just fine. And then we can use this trained model to produce local explanations. And local explanations is a term coming from explainable machine learning. And it refers to the contribution of input variables to a prediction. And here in this example, you see the black box is depicting a machine learning model. And on the left side, we have 4 inputs for one specific data point. And at the lower end, we have the resulting prediction of 0.8. And the local explanations are what you see here in the middle, which reflect the contribution of each of these values to the prediction. And of course, this is not how our model works internally, but it's a post-processing method that allows us to explain the model and specifically this one prediction. And to compute local explanations, we use shapely additive explanations, or short SHAP values, by Lundberg and Lee in 2017. And we chose this method since it can be applied to any model. It's based on game theory and therefore on solid theoretical foundation. So therefore, when I talk about SHAP values or local explanations, I use them as a synonym of each other for the rest of the talk. And of course, we can also plot those not for one prediction, but for time series of predictions. So here we see in the black line the predicted errors of a model, and the colored stacked bar charts are the local explanations for each prediction. And with that, we already have a lot of information which we can further explore to find out how these errors are related to processes. But one thing that you might have noticed, and it's really something that also was mentioned in talks before, whenever you apply explainability methods for machine learning, especially in geoscience, you have to deal with input variable correlation. Because if we have variable correlations, or variable dependency, it results in no stable prediction variable relationships, and also maybe biased local explanations. So to solve this problem, we use not the raw data, but principal components of data, and also further developed methods, which we call PCA SHAP values. And so that means we take our inputs, use a PCA transformation, and then train a machine learning model. And since principal components of data are per definition linearly uncorrelated, correlation will not affect the machine learning model. And then we use PCA SHAP to compute SHAP values for the original variables. And just briefly, here in this flow graph, you see how this is computed. The basic idea is after computing principal components, you know for each principal component, the loading for each variable. And then after training the machine learning model, we get SHAP values for each principal component, and then can recalculate SHAP values for the original variables using the loadings of the PCA. And with that, we can move on to the last part of the learning from mistakes workflow, which is clustering. Since this type of representation is really interesting, but it's so complex that it's hard to interpret. Therefore, we apply clustering to get error clusters, which we can then interpret. And so we use those PCA SHAP values as input for a cluster analysis. And since clustering can potentially be quite subjective, we apply multiple algorithms and multiple numbers of clusters and just choose the best combination by a cluster separation measure. So we use silhouette values. And then we can derive stable cluster of error variable relationships. And then looking at these variables that are important for a specific cluster, we can come up with conclusion which processes might be related to that error. And to show you a bit how this can be done, I will go on with a case study. And this is a case study we did in the Rocky Mountains, a stream temperature modeling of a subalpine headwater stream. And the study site is located west of Calgary, so in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. It's a small stream, and the aim of this case study was to apply a process-based model to this stream and model the first 850 meters. And we had available water temperature measurements, stream water temperature measurements along the stream, discharge measurements, and also meteorological data from a meteorological station just located next to the stream. And for process-based modeling, we use H-flux, a stream water temperature model, which is one-dimensional based on finite difference method, and it solves the mass and energy balance equations. And here below, you see all the energy fluxes that are represented in H-flux, and we run the model with a 1 minute time step, a 1 meter distance step, and we had data starting from August 8 until August 26 in 2019. And the available data we had for our error model came mainly from the weather station located next to the stream, but also we had discharge measurements, and we had the variables relative humidity, discharge, long-wave radiation, wind speed, short-wave radiation, air temperature, and canopy temperature. And what you already see here is that some of these variables, this is our correlation matrix, some of these variables are highly correlated, and thus showing the importance of correcting for this correlation. Otherwise, the relationship between errors and input variables will not be stable. And we applied XGBoost model for our error modeling. And we had roughly 1,700 data points, which are 50-minute time steps of all the hydrological and meteorological variables. And we applied some pre-processing, so mainly we transformed the hours of the day into continuous variables. And we also used lags of data for all other variables. So 8 lags means 2 hours. And the model tuning consists of using 5 random days for testing, cross-validation, and a Bayesian hyperparameter optimization. And when applying this model to predict model errors, we see the results here. So this is the stream temperature, and in blue, you see the observations. In orange, you see the process-based model predictions. And in green, you see the process-based model plus the error model predictions. And you see that most of the errors are pretty well met. And this is also reflected in the RMSE, which is reduced from 0.378 to 0.145. And with these results, we see that there must be some valuable information contained in the variables, as we can predict most of the errors of this process-based model. So therefore, we're going ahead and have a look at the PCA shape values and the error clusters. And this is the graph for the first 2 days of the time period. And we see here is residuals and PCA shape values, and the lines show the predicted residuals. And in gray, we see the process-based model residuals, the original ones. And the stacked bars colored are the PCA shape values of the variables. And in the back, you see colored the error clusters, which we found. And I want to briefly talk about the cluster 3 errors, which mainly occur during starting at noon until the end, late afternoon, and are mainly underestimation and times of large errors. And when we look at the characteristics of cluster 3 errors, we see something like this. So on the left side here, we see the observed values during cluster 3 errors, so all the variables. And we see that there's medium to a high shortwave radiation, high air temperature, high canopy temperature, and lower wind speed and relative humidity. And here on this spider plot, we see the median PCA shape values for all variables, showing which variables are mainly used for predicting these errors. And we see the most important ones are canopy temperature, shortwave radiation, air temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed. And from this and further looking into the time series plots, we came up with the hypothesis for this error cluster, which is that errors of cluster 3 are related to uncertainties in shading. And we came to this conclusion since we know that H-flux assumes constant shading over time. However, this is not the case in this catchment. So the sun shines along the stream at around 2:30 p.m., which means there is no shading during that time. And this hypothesis, we added 2-point shading to H-flux. So therefore, we just used the original shading values and linearly decreased them starting at noon until 2:30 p.m. when they reach 0, and then linearly increase them again until 5 p.m. And after implementing that in the model, so there's no calibration, just slight change of how shading is used, from the results here shown in green, we immediately see that the predicted values for the peaks in stream temperature definitely improved. Of course, it's far from perfect since it's just a rough estimate, but it shows the point and gives evidence to our hypothesis. So in summary, model errors contain valuable information. And the learning from mistakes workflow uses this information to provide evidence for error process relationships. However, interpretation is still difficult and needs expert knowledge. You need to know about the model, about the system. But the good thing is the LFM workflow can be used for any type of process-based model and is not affected by input correlation. And it's also important to point out that how you use this workflow really depends on your application. So if you're a model developer, you will need this information about errors to improve your model or see if which processes maybe are not perfect in the model. And if you're just using it maybe for a decision-making process, it might be interesting to see where the errors are coming from, so you know that your decision is not biased through because of some model errors. Thank you so much, and that's it.
Thank you, Moritz. It's really inspiring to see you get to take this interpretation all the way back to changing the model. We have a few questions in Slido. One of them, let's see. So how do you measure the feature's importance after you've mapped the original feature from high to low dimension space using PCA?
So I can just quickly answer this with this small flow graph. Oh, here, I have it. So what we do is, so we use the principal components as the input for the machine learning model. And so when we compute like the original shape values with that machine learning models, we have shape values for each principal component. And since we know that loading of a principal component with standardized variables is something like, or it's actually the correlation between this principal component and this one specific variable, we could just use this again to weight the principal component shape values again to get shape values for the original variables. I hope this answers the question. Might be a bit difficult to understand if you haven't worked with shape values before. But it's more or less a post-processing of shape values when using principal components as inputs.
Yeah, thanks. That did help me with that. Could you explain again how you identified shading as the key source of error? The shape seemed to me that everything mattered.
Yeah, and of course, I did not tell you the whole truth actually, since so we saw that of course it's hard to see from this plot because we further looked also at the time series plots for these errors, and we noticed they're just during times of high shortwave radiation. But there's also a second process which is kind of reflecting, which is reflected here in the PCA shape values. It's canopy temperature and air temperature. So additionally to the shortwave radiation input, which is hard to see here, but more clearly visible when you look at the time series, we also have some error coming from tree emitted long wave radiation, which is why air temperature and canopy temperature is so important for predicting this, because the H-flux model just uses air temperature to predict the tree emitted long wave radiation, but actually those times it's always it's always during times of very high stream temperature and even much higher canopy temperature. So there's just these two effects as well. And everything becomes much more clear if you see the time series as well, but I just couldn't fit those in the presentation. I hope this answers your question. Maybe you brought more questions.
Yeah. Thanks. I think we have time for one more. If you use this framework for multiple catchments, do you think you would see similar error structures and attribute those to similar inputs?
Potentially. I think it really depends on if you calibrate the model for the whole area or for a single catchment differently. Because I think it's important to understand that here we assume that the model is fully calibrated and it's ready for being applied for decision making or whatever you want to use it for. And if there are like changes in the parameter, of course, this error relationship would change. But I think if you apply the same model, so parameterize for the whole area, then it should be possible to get a more universal answer from that.
Great, thank you so much.